All right, guys, we're back. If you're just popping on, we did a segment of this earlier, and the audio, I guess, cut out, and I didn't notice for 20 minutes, which is super frustrating and unfortunate. And I'm not going to start over exactly, so you'll have to watch the first 8 minutes of the last segment if you want to catch up. But basically, I will try to kind of summarize. Unfortunately, I have different windows open for that. So basically, we're talking about music as the universal cosmic architecture and causal law made audible. And we had worked our way through the first 4 intervals. I think I might have skipped the third and the fourth, because eventually we're going to do entire segments on each interval and correlate those things in all sorts of other systems. So try to get back on track with what we were talking about here. And I will edit these together so that they flow and there's a nice, complete explanation. So I guess let's just jump right into where we were. 5 is a number that governs cycles, right? And if we recall that this all began with a paradox, that the only possible unity is actually nothingness. And because all of the generative mechanisms in the universe are recursive and the universe is holographic, that paradox is embedded in everything that followed, right? So the 5 chord, the 5 interval actually is the most stable. But when we add the 3rd and the 7th, we get the most dissonance or instability of any chord built on any scale degree so far, right? So this gives us a bunch of choices. And it's interesting because if you're going to make a choice, then you need to be able to stand on your own 2 feet. That's stability, right? But there also has to be some conflict, some dissonance. Otherwise, there would be no motive to make a decision, right? So we have journeyed from the 1. I think I changed keys on. Well, let's go there. Yeah, to the 5. And now we have a choice. The strongest pull, the will of God, would be to return to the 1. But if we choose not to do that, there are a couple of common options, and one of them is called a tritone resolution. The tritone is this: the devil's interval, Diabolus in Musica. So you can pivot on a tritone substitution and take the devil's path and not return to God. So that's interesting. But then if you consider that another option is to use a melodic superimposition of the diminished, which is made of what? Tritones. Diabolus in Musica again. It is the most dissonant chord. It has really no gravitational center. It's perfectly symmetrical. And every note in the diminished resolves to something. So you can use it to pivot to any one of the notes. Like this one here is B flat, right? Or, yeah, it's B flat. So it will resolve to B major instead of returning to wherever it is that you came from. Or you could go to E major, right? Or you can go down 2 half steps to a minor from any one of the 4 notes. So it gives you 8 options. So maximum dissonance, maximum choice, maximum instability, maximum choice, right? But let's say that we don't want to take the devil's path. But we don't want to return home to God either. we can go to the 6. Another number associated with the devil, right? The 6 up an octave is the 13th, which is also associated with the devil. The 6 is considered the inverted reflection of the 1. And this is where things really got interesting and how this whole situation got my attention, right? Because I thought every mode in any key is just the same notes as the tonic mode in a different order. So what makes the 6th degree special? What makes it special is that it is the only mode that naturally asserts its own tonic as the new gravitational center. It is a derivative that asserts itself as dominant over its source. It is the shadow reflection of the source. It is the devil. And it is trying to assert itself as God of the new tonality. But it doesn't stop there. Let me have a look at my notes here. Yeah, so the derivative seeks primacy over the origin. Mythologically speaking, the devil is not pure negation, but a rival center of gravity in the cosmic harmonic field. Musically speaking, the devil is a mode within it that attempts to recenter the system on itself. Anyone that's familiar with the left-hand path should notice the eerie consonants. So the question was, how does an acoustic system replicate mythological narratives so precisely down to numerical symbolism and functional dynamics, unless both are expressions of a deeper generative template? Lucifer isn't a being. Lucifer is a system component that destabilizes a global attractor and tries to replace it, right? The association of 6 and 13 with the adversary is not superstition, but a mythological compression of system dynamics. These numbers index structural inflection points in recursive generative systems, points at which symmetry threatens hierarchy, derivatives challenge their source, and coherent subsystems acquire the capacity to recenter the whole. 6 marks the threshold at which distributed subsystems achieve coherent symmetry and can rival a centralized attractor. 13 marks basis overflow, the point at which a system exceeds its canonical symmetry class and must recurse into a higher order frame. The Lucifer myth frames these points of dynamic instability as adversarial forces because they correspond to autonomy, divergence, and the destabilization of hierarchical order. The devil is what happens when a system becomes complex enough to model itself and attempt self-governance. This is why these things have been demonized, not because they're inherently evil. In fact, they're contextually good. And there are how do you say there are conditions. Yeah, it's context. I had a better word, but we'll get back to that. So Lucifer is also the source of, or associated with, illumination. And illumination is often defined as self-awareness developed to a degree that facilitates self-engineering and, by extension, self-governance, right? So the full Western major scale consists of 12 semitones. So if we start on A, right? But if we go 13, we've arrived at a new scale, a new octave. A new octave, right? So we have passed this threshold, and it's the 13th half step. If you stack chord degrees, right? So we have 1, 3, 5, 7. You keep going, you have 9, 11, 13. There's no 15. Once you reach 13, the entity is fully realized, and there's nowhere to go from there. And so the zodiac, illuminated by the 13th thing, the sun. 6 as well has a lot of different modalities of expression that relate to this, right? So basically, music is not a metaphor for the universe. Music is not just a representation of cosmology. Music and cosmology are both expressions of the same underlying recursive generational processes and informational dynamics. Music is a micro-universe made of audible causal law. That's what it is. That's what it does. That's what it's for. Let's go a little bit deeper into this. So, just looking at my notes again. Sorry, guys. I thought I had this organized a little better. Ah, 13 as meta level threshold. 13 shows up when a system crosses a basis limit and moves to a higher recursion layer. So there's our octave, right? 13 lunar cycles in a solar year. In human chromosomes, 13 mutations cause large-scale phenotype reorganization. In physics, string theory formulates 13 effective dimensions. 13 basically is recursive overflow. It marks when a system exceeds its canonical basis and must reference a higher order frame. So, so at 6, subsystems become autonomous, and at 13, the system transcends its governing basis. These are points where control hierarchy destabilizes. So the association of 6 and 13 with the adversary is not superstition, but an emergent feature of recursive systems. 6 marks the threshold at which distributed subsystems achieve coherent symmetry, and can rival a centralized attractor. 13 marks basis overflow, the point at which a system exceeds its canonical symmetry class and must recurse into a higher order frame. Myth calls these dynamic instabilities adversarial forces because they correspond to autonomy, divergence, and the destabilization of hierarchical order. So, the utility of all this, there's actually quite a bit of it. Let me check back in with the chat. It's a little weird to have jumped back into this, honestly, because my flow got a little bit disrupted by the issue with the. But did you see what happened? I don't know if I mentioned this. When you get to the 5 chord and you have this choice, either to go back to source or not, you either take the devil's tritone path to pivot, or, and these are the most common choices in music, you go from the 5 to the 6 chord and there's Lucifer. Like, hey, this is the new, I am God of this modality. And then if you make it past that, the elimination process starts. You reach the threshold. And what happens at the threshold? You lose your tonal or your gravitational center. You know what I mean? Your identity breaks down. There's no key center really all of a sudden. You could go to 8 different, modalities. It exactly reflects every fucking system in the universe, including that of spiritual elimination, or, you can label this process different things. Processes in chemistry, systems, dynamics, whatever. Let me check in with the chat real quick. Yeah. So, so I wanted to talk a little bit about the applications of this, because I think this got cut off in the other segment when the sound went out too. By the way, please hit the like button, share, subscribe, consider becoming a patron. We are demonetized, and we rely entirely on your support, so that I can justify putting all this time into this stuff. So, we have empiricism and intuition at odds with each other in our culture. Tremendous dissonance and duality, number 2, right? Something I didn't mention about the number 2 earlier, when we get to the second degree, we have the first minor modality, right? And so then if you play 2 notes at once, doesn't matter which 2 unless it's a unison, you also get this dissonance that results in a third thing, which is the harmony, right? But I forgot to mention that if you play a second interval together, it's also the most dissonant. So these numbers have that same function everywhere throughout the entire system. Whatever their essence is expressed in the same way. So what I was getting at, though, before the thing reminded me of duality, empiricism and intuition butting heads, right? And one of the issues with this is that when science can't explain something, it foments distrust of science and it increases superstition, right? And what the kind of work that I do, transdisciplinary compression of patterns, I guess, or let's put it a different way. When you arrive at this crossroads, Hermes is there, and he's like, as above, so below. And you're like, what? And he's like, well, look, if you observe recursive generative mechanisms at the level of Calabi-Yau and deep brain manifolds, subquantum layer of physics, the most fundamental generative layer that we have found, and maybe the most fundamental. And then you see the Fibonacci sequence building spiral universes and the galaxies in the same way. And then you see DNA replicating and, doing its thing in basically the same way, this recursive process. And you see this mirror symmetrical thing in all of it. You look at music, the white and black keys on a piano, right? I never noticed this until I started thinking about all this stuff, but the white and black keys, the white are the major and the black are the flat, or the natural, and the black are the flat and sharp keys, right? So the flat keys are mirror imagery inversions of the natural version. So A, and then you go to the A flat on the black keys, and it's exactly a mirror reflection, like this, it's universal. So these questions that science can't answer, because they say everything has to be measurable, observable, repeatable, and that's all good. I'm not saying that that's not, that empiricism has no place in the universe. But at what point do we aggregate enough circumstantial evidence from this, the universality of these characteristics, before it becomes evidence that we can extrapolate and apply to, is the universe a recursive, cyclical process, as Penrose has suggested in the Hindu opening and closing of the Eye of Shiva? When the eye opens, the universe is destroyed, and when it closes, the universe is created. And if you think about this, really the point of all this is, and also this is implied by the recursive nature of it all, the only way to frame the universe's existence so it makes any sense to me is that what we think of as God is like the end product, right? And the creation and the evolution of this consciousness are like isomorphic. They're reflections of each, they're recursive, right? So this opening of the Eye of Shiva at the end of time, this is like is it systems theory, I guess, or just information dynamics, where when an information node reaches a certain level of density, it's an omega point and it can't go any further. The thing is, that doesn't result in homeostasis. That results in collapse, right? So once the universe has exhausted all of its possibilities, with everything that's possible within the frame of reference, or within the parameters, the generative restraints, right, of natural law, that mind that it's been cultivating would be at its omega point as well. The eye would open, maximum conscious state of the universe, but then it collapses and goes back to sleep. And you know what I mean? It is an exact, that cosmology is an exact reflection of like systems theory dynamics. So Hermes says, you dumb motherfuckers, like at a certain point, your empiricism, like if you take anything too far, you end up like back where you were kind of thing, you know? Things are all poles, opposite poles of the same thing. So if you take empiricism too far, you're going to end up fucking stupid because you have destroyed common sense and you have undermined pattern recognition, right? Which is what intelligence fundamentally is. So when you remove intuition and really common sense, but let's stick with intuition here, from the equation, you're sort of disabling, you know, a primary constituent, operational element of intelligence. You can't do that. You're going to end up with a lopsided, fucked up world full of chaos and nonsense that doesn't make any sense and isn't guided by reason or fucking, you know, you know what I mean? Like, this is easy. And then also, as we'll see when we get into the seventh degree of the scale and how it works over the 5 when it comes time to make these decisions, another layer of the use case for this kind of knowledge, right? Let me check in with the chat again. Was that making sense to everyone? If it's all source, why differentiate between? That's definitely more in the realm of like metaphysical speculation than this project is really geared for, but I'll step outside of that and try to address that. I mean, you know, it's the universe, right? The premise of this thing that I'm presenting here is that music is the like fundamental generational and functional archetypal blueprint or whatever for everything, right? And part of what I was getting at by, you know, exposing these weird correspondences between the numerological associations with the Lucifer myth and the functional harmony of the 6th degree, which is also the 13th and all that. We have a subconscious connection to those kind of things because our mind is running on the same operating system, right? It knows the nodes. It knows what the 6th and the 13th, and it knows what a bifurcation manifold is in different contexts and whatnot, you know? So we call the universe because we fucking know that, right? And to get like more specifically in line with your inquiry, why would I play a song? Why would I play any particular song? Because otherwise I'm just sitting here, you know? The devil's bargain, basically, one way that this is framed, is that there's absolute nothingness, which is the only possible perfection because the all is mind, right? So it's allegory. So if you have darkness, then you have evil because the veil or the 0 point field or the conversion layer of the universal mind from the ideal to the actual at the Calabi-Yau manifold D-brain scale, like no matter how you want to think about it, it is an allegory translation machine, basically. All that is metaphor. So as soon as you have a stain, a fracture, a color, a thought, or even recognition of self, which is how a lot of different cosmologies, including physics now, frame this. I heard one physicist trying to explain quantum loop by saying that the best way she could explain it in layman's term is that it's as if a pre-existing state reflected itself. That whole recursive generation thing all over again, for one thing, but also Just like this idea that nothingness became conscious, and that consciousness is what created duality, because now there wasn't just the thing, the no thing, there was the no thing and its awareness of itself, and that was light, basically, right? So once that happened, we had like a stain, a fracture. Duality was implicit. It's a mathematical necessity. You can't get away with it from it. Like, not only when you add a second note to the scale, you get a minor mode, right? So there's the one, that's the major. At the two, we have duality, right? Oh shit, where was I going with that? It's a good one. I've forgotten so quickly. Damn it, what the hell was I talking about? I even put my mic in its holder so I could like work the whole thing out on the guitar, and then absolutely completely forgot what I was doing. Oh yeah, I remember now. Sorry. When we have the triad, right, the trinity, the first three notes of the chord, right? When we add the seventh, we now have a symmetrical unit, right? 4 notes, cut it in half. The top half of this chord is minor. So as soon as the chord becomes symmetrical, duality is introduced into the equation, right? So it's, in a sense, a mathematical consequence of creation, and it's also an absolute necessity. This project actually has given me better language to explain this than I used to have, because the best I could do in the past was to say evil is there because good is there, and they literally opposites create each other. And a better way of explaining that, it's more about instability or chaos or dissonance, because that instability is what creates deviations in systems, right? Without it, there would be nowhere to go. This is why when we play the diminished chord over the 5, right? So we're here, and then we can, now we're in C major. We put the devil's interval, the most dissonant, chaotic framework, over top of when we need to make a decision. All of a sudden, if we use that, we add that's not the correct thing to play over that chord. It's the most unstable fucking thing you can introduce, and then all of a sudden, rather than a few choices, you have 8 choices for modulating to different keys, right? So the point of all this, really, to get back to your question, though, is that that's the big question. Was it worth it to descend? Like, when people talk about Lucifer rebelling against God, what they actually mean is that this nothingness was absolute perfection, because that's the only possible perfection is nothingness. You can't have perfection without nothingness, because as soon as you have a line or a shadow, you know what I mean, you have stained it, it's not perfect anymore, right? If you have a thing and space, you have 2 things, and there's duality again. So your 2 options in the universe, 0 equals 2. You either remain in this perfect infinite nothingness that you're calling source, or I'm calling source, I guess, sometimes, or you descend, you rebel against God. So anything that has any desire or moves or wants to do anything other than just be nothing, perfect nothingness, is rebelling against God. That's what this really means. And the light bearer is actually an oscillating wave, right? What gives rise to light? And so it's also that chaos, or not chaos, but symmetry, that the symmetry of that oscillating wave and its asymmetry, but its symmetry, they compelled things to order. So again, we have this symmetrical interval, right? That is the light bearer in music that gives all these options, and it's just nuts. But let me try to get back on track here. So to descend into matter, and they are his laws, not because they're just. They're not just because they're his laws, or his laws because they are just, is how, some ancient adept types put it back in the day. Right? What that actually means is that the laws of creation are predicated as they are because they could not be predicated any other way and have a creation. They are this way because they must be. Do you think God is stupid or frivolous? You know what I mean? And by God, I mean even just reason and its architecture. You can just call it that. That's usually how I think about it. Except, occasionally things get weird enough that I'm like, maybe this thing is more than just reason. And, of course I think that. But, yeah, so do you like doing stuff, or do you want eternal nothingness? Because those are the two options. That's why we're here. Why deviate from source? We didn't. It's all a hologram. Everything is true and false, and it's true and false to say these things are true and false is not mystical gibberish. It is true because the universe's generative mechanisms are recursive, and it all began with a paradox that one is none. And so this is a thing that gives people a really hard time, especially if you're neurotypical and you have linear thought process, because you don't want to do that. You don't want to go, okay, it's both things. Evil is good, because without instability and chaos, we would go nowhere. We would just be like stuck in at best, one conduit of possibilities. At best. It's a structural necessity. People don't like trying to think like that, I've noticed. It causes them grief. It doesn't cause me any grief. Dealing with the consequences of reality that's a reality gives me grief. But conceptually, I have no problem with it. I understand that the logic, the arithmetic that's inherent in it. Everything in the universe actually makes perfect fucking sense. We really don't have any reason for metaphysical speculation, particularly in terms of the parameters of ethics and accountability and social ethics, and you know what I mean? It's really all algorithmic, and truth is only relative if you don't know what your goal state is. Right? Relative to what? That's the thing. And one of the things I realized recently is that humanity is never going to get its shit together until it can agree on a collective goal state. The thing is, the collective goal state attractor already exists. So we don't have to worry about figuring it out in terms of the engineering. Our job is discovery. And at this point, we really do have the wisdom and the toolkit to shine a light right on the face of this goal state attractor. It's really not even hard to figure out. The collective goal state is for humanity to figure out how to optimize all socioeconomic and political systems to best support the full expression of human potential and creativity with the minimum investment of labor. And the only reason all of our systems aren't oriented that way is because there's a little tiny group of psychopaths that don't want that to happen. It's that simple. It really is. If you're still arguing with your friends about capitalism, socialism, any of these ism schism games, you're basically a moron. Like, the truth can be determined algorithmically. And if you haven't worked it out that way, just shut up. You don't need to worry about it. You know what I mean? Capitalism, socialism, all of these things are discussed and put into the social narrative, fucking mixing bowl, because they represent extremes of polarities that, are either completely and entirely self-centered and left-hand path, or excessively collectively oriented. The reality is you have to optimize for homeostasis between these things. That's weird. I live in the middle of nowhere in the Andes, and there are a bunch of people with flashlights walking down the mountain towards my house that I can see out the window, but then they all turn them off at the same time. That kind of bothers me, because that's a weird fucking move. I mean, it's dark. They definitely did. All the flashlights went off at the same time on the side of a muddy, steep hill in the mountains. Anyways, I'm just going to ignore that for the moment. Check in with the chat. Is gnosis ever bad? Well, gnosis just means direct knowledge and experience. So I would say fundamentally no, because it is by definition the truth, whether it's pleasant or not, One mystic put it this way, that real illumination is not really about becoming a passive, fluffy bundle of light. There may be a stage where that is true and appropriate, but what enlightenment really is to have become like he or it in whom suffering and glory are indistinguishable. And what was meant by that is that the universal mind is only experiencing. It is not biased. So horrific, the most horrific, terrible, just awful thing you can possibly think of is just as desirable experientially as, the most amazing, incredible, pleasant thing that you could possibly imagine to the underlying consciousness in the universe. So, and then if you look at like Penrose's CCC theory, where the universe is basically a well, not the universe exactly, but the process, I guess, the universe is like data compilation. Like, if you think of, I always use the example of an oak tree and a acorn. The acorn can't make oak trees unless it has a history, a blueprint, for oak trees. And that happened from a single cell before, it started dividing, becoming more complex, just like when the universe was nothing and became two. Just as cells divide and you know what I mean? Recursive. Over a process of cycles of creation and destruction, death and rebirth, that single-celled organism became a frog, which became a better frog and a better frog and a better frog, and is still becoming a better frog now through the same process, right? And it does that through this recursive generative process. If a frog does that, the universe is doing it. You know what I mean? This is what this whole as above, so below thing is really telling us. So it is compiling and then improving upon that database with each regeneration, we hope anyways. And one of the reasons for conscious awareness, I think there's two things, because one of the philosophical arguments against like the law of necessity, that everything happens because it has to happen, is that, well, what about human consciousness? What about self-awareness? What's the necessity in that? I do have an answer. If we are indeed data scraping devices for the universe, basically, that's why we put so much energy and money into physics, biology, all the sciences. Then at a certain point, complexity requires consciousness in order to solve and navigate its problems and systems. And that's recursive as well, because as I was saying about the universal mind, the human mind is doing the same thing with its environment. It's a recursive process, right? So the other thing that it does is that without sentience and ego, like self-awareness and id, there would be no point of reference for what constitutes improvement in a lot of ways. Change the center and the same data becomes a different reality. It's funny too, there are 13 people in the chat right now, and I started this talking about the 6th and the 13th, and I don't think I ever really finished explaining all of the all of the relevance, and it just became Friday the 13th, I just noticed. Which is extra hilarious, I guess, considering what the subject matter was when we started. So it's getting kind of late for me, and I really got to finish this Substack, man. This is it just keeps, it's a holographic system. So as I said earlier, it just keeps unfolding and unfolding and unfolding. And, any direction you want to push, it's going to go. I'm just looking for, my notes are so insanely long at this point. These correspondences emerge because harmonic systems, numerological reductions, and cognitive attractor models are all manifestations of centered relational networks. Mythology noticed these structures phenomenologically long before formal mathematics existed. That's one way to put it. Yeah, so this whole archetypal blueprint thing, it has so many functionalities because it is a teacher. People talk about music as a teacher, but it can be difficult to really wrap your head around what that actually means. Without some really deep contemplation and technical expertise, you got to know the map. So, like if you look at the structure of chord progressions, say if we're in minors the 2, E's the 5, 6 is there, so we would go. I told you guys it's late, man. It's F sharp. It's F sharp minor. So you're sad. 2, 6, 5-1. See, I'm not even going to try to do this anymore because my brain is melting. I mean, that's some basic shit. It's hilarious because I was like, you got to have some expertise navigating the territory. And then I'm like, durr. Anyways, what I was getting at is what that progression illustrates is that, you have some sadness, and then that provokes you to make a decision. That sadness may provoke you to go into like a darker, shadowy kind of reflection of your natural state. And then you have to make a decision, and then you go home. Like they're maps of all kinds of different processes. And then if you take that chord progression and you lay it over chemical processes, you'll see correlations, none of that I think is really what I was getting at, except that the point kind of is that any centered, discrete, relational system with low energy ratios will produce the same archetypal roles. That's why this stuff works. I did have another point, and it fell out of my brain. My music is such a perfect esoteric mirror. Yeah, it's almost 1 a.m, and I'm bummed that we got interrupted earlier because I was much more on a roll, and now I'm kind of tired and disintegrating a little bit on you guys. Clearly. I think I was going to talk also a little bit about 4, the structure, and how a 4th up an octave is an 11. So if you have an identity and you go into like an awakening process and you experience this 11-11, the 11 is the higher reflection of this 4, and that is also recursive. So the 1 and the 1, right? The reflection at a higher scale. This 11-11 thing is implied by the 4 and its octave at the 11th. And, okay, here's the thing I'll leave you with, because I think I can explain this without falling apart. Jam bands, right? They stretch things out. And it's interesting because there's another physical analogy for what should be a vibratory thing. But if you really listen to like a long Grateful Dead jam, when they get into those super weird out there places, it sounds, the music is like it's stretching, and we call it stretching out the melody, like you'll also notice that it almost always, probably always, when it gets weird like that, doesn't matter who's doing it, it slows way the fuck down, because you don't want to break the invisible thread, right? You have to maintain this conceptual continuity. So, do as thou wilt shall be the whole of the law was often taken by people to mean do whatever you want. What it actually means is that at any given moment, if you're really doing your true will, there's only one lawful choice. The more freedom you have, in a sense, the more sovereignty you have, the less freedom you have. If you are absolutely constrained to your fundamental purpose, which could also be framed as what? God's will. That's the most hilarious thing about the association of Crowley with Satanism. Because really his message, framed in an older, verbiage or whatever, was fundamentally, you have no right but to do God's will. That's his message, the satanic message. And so when these bands are going out, to these really insane places that are musically very dissonant and chaotic and weird, and they have no tonal center, and, the reality is that it's the most difficult type of music to play, because you really only have one choice at any given time. It's like, if I play G major, I have that scale I can play. I have a shit ton of things I can do. But once we get out there into some, weird fucking inverted sharp 11 dominant fucking whatever, and we're playing octatonic symmetrical scales over it and whatnot, there's only so much you can do that actually makes sense. You know, it becomes a very thin line that you're walking. And you really have to know what you're doing. And like, look, if we go 1, 4, 5, 1, that's all well within the, you know, rules. All of the tensions are being satisfied. The most, what is it, Langrian action, right? The path of least resistance. But if we get to this 5 chord and we decide we're gonna, well, let's see, there's the tritone, so then we can go to, you know, F sharp or whatever, and now we're there. So then we just think, well, you know, let's do a 5 of 5 sub from there and get into another mess, and then somebody starts playing a diminished over the 5 chord, and somebody jumps on, like, you know, okay, well, let's go to E flat minor instead of, you know, wherever that sounded like it was going. And then you keep doing this, and you go further and further and further out, you know, and you can break down the structures and make them more dissonant and shit, and you have less and less and less and less options. Even though it sounds like you're just doing whatever the fuck you want, you know. So in order to get back, though, the Akashic record of people's minds in the audience, you know, is not going to forget anything. All that information is aggregated in the system, right? So if you don't know what you've been doing and why you've been doing it, and, like, you know, the whole fucking conduit to wherever it is that you ended up, and the further out you go, the harder it is to get back, right? So your level of knowledge and understanding and mastery has to be so much greater in order to go into all these weird places and have all this freedom that isn't freedom. You know, so when we think about these things as like the devil's path, the crossroads and shit, there's truth in there. Because before you take those options, you better make sure you understand what you're doing. Otherwise, you're going to get lost and you're never going to find your way home to the source. And that's hell. You know, and trust me, if you have ever been in a jam band and you've gone too far out and you can't figure out how to get back to the tonic, it's fucking hell. I mean, it sucks. You hear when it happens to Grateful Dead, you know, there's like this, if there's a, say, a 40-minute Dark Star that actually works from the very first note, there's like this tension thread that runs through the entire thing, and the music can stop almost. And totally just, you know, they've gone through all these different tonalities and, you know, it's just, but there's like this weird tenuous thread that's always been there. And if they lose that, they just have to limp back into the head, you know, like you can tell that they're like, oh shit, what the fuck, you know, and it happens sometimes. The thing is, even though music is a real holographic projection of causal law and, you know, information systems dynamics or whatever, like in real life, you can't just put the motif back up by, you know what I mean? The stakes are a little bit different. But if you know the rules of the game, play. Ride the spiral to the end. You may just go where no one's been. What else does he say in that song? Ride the spiral of our divinity and still be human. That's another level of this magic trick. Yeah, man. It didn't go exactly how I wanted. I mean, you guys are not going to believe the other shit that unpacks from this. It's so difficult. Because I have to understand all of these different disciplines enough to, like, make sure that, you know, it's a lot of damn work. So please consider supporting the channel. You can make one-time contributions to any of the stuff in the chat, or you can become a patron, or you can fly down here and hang out with me for a week or two or a month, really. I'm never doing a 7-day again. Not because it went badly exactly, at least not with traveling. Maybe here, but like I just feel like we didn't even have time to really get settled in. You know, I think the 10-day minimum is going to be in effect again for retreat events. I let it slide a little bit, and like I said, it wasn't like things went south or anything. It's just it just wasn't enough time to get settled into the jungle vibe and like really get deep with stuff. And especially if I'm coming back up here, because, you know, to go from sea level to 13,000 feet all of a sudden, man, that was way worse than I thought it would be. And so, by the way, like a lot of this stuff I can explain in terms of like systems theory and, you know, all these other things, all these other frameworks, but there are elements of it that are still too weird to really to write off as coincidence, but also to explain in terms of anything scientific. Like, could be a coincidence, totally could. But this tritone note, right? If we put it in the pentagram, in the pentatonic, right, there's 5 notes. We make 6 notes. Now the double's there. Right? That's called a blue note, particularly if it's bent a little bit. Right? The origin story of Satan is serious. The blue star. The light of Lucifer is described as blue by occultists. The blue note has nothing to do with any of that shit in terms of like where it got its name. So that one bugs me a little bit. That's going to be a hard one to separate from, you know, how the hell did that happen? Because supposedly the, is it the Tzedi or something that worship the Satan, that's the, you know, origin myth of Satan, came from this horror entity that is supposedly Iwas. Anyways, long story. But the blue star of all these occult traditions is directly correlated to this blue note that is the devil's interval. The relationship between dissonance and symmetry is bizarre too, because like if we take the diminished chord and we play it as a scale, that's actually the whole tone, which I think is also, I think it's almost, no, it is, it's got to be symmetrical. Isn't it symmetrical? It's completely symmetrical. No, there's 2 of them. Is it symmetrical? I think it is probably. Anyways, what I meant was this. Right, the diminished scale. You can either play it half step, whole, or whole step half. So there's only 2 different versions of it that cover every key. And then it doesn't really like have a tonal center. Whole tone definitely doesn't. Augmented also symmetrical and is based on the tritone, but thinking about it in a different way. That's like a sharp 4 instead of a flat 5. When you play a diminished chord on the guitar, right, so this is the root right now, but if I move it up 4 frets, it's all the same notes in a different order. And if you move it up another 4 frets, it's all the same notes in a different order. And there are only 3 different diminished chords that actually are composed of different notes. And those relationships of 4, a set of 3 composed of symmetrical 4s is fundamental to all kinds of different things in chemistry and physics and shit. What else was I going to say about that, though? And the way that it gives you the option to go anywhere. You know, so here's F. And then if you go up a half step, it resolves to F sharp. If you start here on B, you can resolve it to C. If you start on D, you can resolve it to E flat major. If you know, what the hell? And then the same chord down to E flat minor, down to A minor, down to C minor, down to you know, this is just a very, very strange thing. I haven't really figured out how it does this. Yeah, that's super fucking weird. But the symmetry without the tonal symmetry, or without the tonal center thing, there are profound lessons in that, I think, is where I was going with that. You know, and it also mirrors the whole breaking down at the threshold of the 7 thing. Like, you know, light refracts into the 7 colors of a rainbow. The ego dissolution, before you go up an octave, right? You have no self. It breaks down. You don't. What am I doing? You know, it could be anywhere. It could be anything. It's just nuts because it basically proves the holographic nature of the universe and that there is a fundamental generative blueprint that is recursive for everything, including non-physical systems and like psychological processes and shit. You know, it's not like it's just chemistry and physics. Yeah, so thank you guys so much for spending this time with me. It's getting late, and I'm tired, so I do appreciate you all. Consider supporting us. We are going to have some events in the Sacred Valley still. I'm sure I'll acclimate again within a few days. And in the jungle, probably some in Tambopata and some a few hours lower. I don't know whether it's south or east or whatever, but it's lower in the mountains near Kiabamba in the jungle. So shoot me an email if you're interested in those things or consultations or whatever, and I'll see you guys tomorrow night.